Hi everyone, we are from Group 1 and we are going to present about comparative analysis of GDP and its compositions among countries, including OIC countries. Here are our group members: Abdullatif Ahmed, Hema A, Maheswaran, it's me, Sarasvathy A, Balasubramanian, and last Maiza Madiha Binti Mazlan. What is GDP? GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it represents the total monetary value of all final goods and services produced over a specific time period within a country's borders. And GDP tracks the health of a country's economy, and the most commonly used measure of economic activity and the measure of a nation's economic growth from one period to the next. The composition of GDP. GDP is made up for the total market value of final goods and services produced in an economy. And a few things that are omitted from GDP, like not all productive activity is included in GDP, like unpaid work such as that performed in the home or by volunteers. And black market activities are not included because they are difficult to measure and value accurately. For instance, unpaid work like if a baker who produces a loaf of bread for a customer, it would contribute to GDP, but it would not contribute to GDP if he baked the same loaf of bread for his family. Although the ingredients that he purchased would be counted, but it won't count as GDP. There are four components of GDP: personal consumptions, business investment, government spendings, and last net export, which is export minus import. Consumption. Consumption means the spending by households on goods and services, and it not including spending on new houses. For example, food, household, medical expenses, rent, and jewelry. The second is investment. Investment means the spending by firms on new factories or office buildings, like construction of purchase of machinery or equipments for factory. And government spending. Government spending means the spending by federal, state, or local governments on final goods and services, and it's called investment expenditures by government. For example, purchase of weapons for military, salaries of public servants, or education services. And the last net export, which is export minus import. Export means all goods and services produced for overseas consumption, and import means any goods and services imported for consumption from other countries. This is example for countries by GDP in 2014. This is for countries by GDP per capita in 2014, and this is for countries by real GDP growth rate in 2014. Okay. Why is the GDP contribution of the 57 Organization of Islamic Cooperation Countries (OIC)? Because the Islamic countries are known to be a diverse group in terms of their economic structures, levels of development, political systems, and ethnic backgrounds. So the OIC countries will be examined in three subgroups, which is the first group is classified as the least development members of the OIC, and the second group includes the middle income OIC countries. And the last group is comprises the oil exporting, which is FEC members of OIC. Here's the example of OIC countries' GDP in 2016. The 57 member states and territories of the OIC contributed around 6.425 trillion to the world's GDP in 2016. This is equivalent to 8.51% of the world's GDP. The OIC countries with the 10 highest GDPs are Indonesia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iran, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh in descending order. The OIC's contribution to world GDP is not proportionate to its population size. And last, the population of the 57 states and territories was around 1.769 billion in 2016, which is 23.77% of the world's people. It's all according to the World Bank data.
Be talking about main issues related to GDP. The first issue is global rebounding. Domestic demand has declined in Q1 2021 but was protected by a relatively lower decline in private consumption at negative 1.5%. Exports are boosted to 18.2% in Q1 because global economic activities has been improvised. Global GDP is projected to expand by 5.6% and then moderate to 4.3% in 2022. However, it remains 1.9% below pre-pandemic projections. Malaysia's economy is projected to grow by 4.5% in 2021, which is lower than the initial projections that is 6.0%. They have chose a slower pathway to suppress the pandemic and to roll out vaccine. Lastly, business faced severe revenue shocks during the movement restrictions, where 64% firms has reported losses during Second Conditional Movement Control Order (CMCO) from the months October until December 2020. Average firm has only 4.9 months of cash flow reserves, which is much lower than their regional peers. The second one is to overcoming the pandemic. So these are the steps. The first is to carry out effective find, test, trace, isolate support (FFTIS) strategies. This is needed to ensure safe reopening of economic sectors. Second is to accelerate vaccine rollouts and sustain public communications. For example, they can hold up campaigns that can address vaccine hesitancy and improve vaccination rates for all. This can also increase momentum ahead. Third, near-term fiscal policy will need to strengthen the health system. They can also provide additional financial support for vulnerable groups. Lastly is to ensure the well-being of the citizens by increasing the depth of the social protection system. They can provide a minimum level of protection for those in need because it has been highlighted that the number of vulnerable households seeking assistance has increased throughout the pandemic. The last issue is affected sectors. So private sectors is the driver of a post-pandemic recovery, needing support to boost against future shocks and to boost its resilience. This is crucial to create better jobs and economic transformation. In order to achieve this, they have to ensure clear and accessible programs to provide relief to firms. Second, improving predictability of standard operating procedure (SOP). Third is to expediting approvals and distributions of existing loan and grant programs. Towards achieving long-term resilience, measures introduced must be gearing towards firm efficiency. That is, addressing financing constraints for digital adoption. Second is to improve government assistance programs, especially for small medium enterprises, which is known as SMEs, with better identifications of needs of firms. Third and lastly is developing enabling framework that provides more efficient and inclusive financial services, particularly to SMEs businesses. So the graph shown the percentage change from corresponding quarter of preceding year from 2019 and 2021. But we are now focusing on Q1 2020 and Q2 2022. Q2 2020 and Q2 2021. So, as we can see, from Q1 2020 to quarter 2 2020, the GDP rapidly decreased from 0.7% to negative 70.2%. However, from quarter 1 2021 to quarter 2 2021, the GDP rapidly increased from negative 0.5% to 60.1%.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Abdullatif Maad, and today I will be explaining about the government policies to address the GDP issues in Malaysia, as well as explain the results of these policies. Now, what are the policies that the Malaysian government used in order to help the GDP in Malaysia of these past years? Now, of course, pre COVID 19, the Malaysian government's economy was relatively stable. However, the only notable fact was the fact that the economy was stuck in the middle income trap. Now, when COVID 19 hit, of course, this was a huge problem because being stuck in the middle income trap, meaning the government really needed to pull their weight together and come up with plans to ensure that the Malaysian economy does not fall. Now, they came up with the National Recovery Plan. And there are three main points of this national recovery plan. First of all, is to fight the COVID 19 pandemic, to help digitalize business activities, as well as stimulate the economy. Now, in the first part, which is to fight the COVID 19 pandemic, the medical sectors and whatnot were allocated 13.233 billion ringgit to help fight the country as well as transition from the COVID 19 pandemic back into our normal daily lives as well. To help. And of course, much of this money was used in order to research vaccines as well as purchase and distribute these vaccines. Now, the second part of this would be the digitalization of business activities, and a total of 9.655 billion ringgit was allocated for this. Now, this money would then be used to help businesses in order to transition from your normal physical face to face business activities to digital businesses or online business. This would ensure that business activity is still going on, even though the country is on lockdown and many people cannot leave their homes. Now, the final part of this would be to stimulate the economy. And of course, because of COVID 19, many companies and as well as businesses and stores had to shut down because, of course, they couldn't do any business activity. And of course, the economy wasn't stimulating, so no money was generated. And businesses were given, of course, this is, of course, all businesses in Malaysia that are registered. They were given a total of 12.162 billion ringgit to help them to stimulate the economy, as well as get them back on track. Now, the second part of the policy would be responses to COVID 19. So they introduced policies such as the SOP or Standard Operating Procedure, which meant that there needed to be social distancing of at least 6 meters from one person to another, as well as using antibacteria in antibacteria soap and all that everywhere you go, whether it be in malls or in your house, everywhere. And of course, they opened up the economy in phases, meaning that in different phases, different economic sectors would be opened up. So, for example, in phase one, only vital essentials were opened up, such as the food and beverages industries, which were only, of course, there was no dining allowed, but you were only really able to purchase essentials like food and all that. And of course, phase two means more economic sectors such as clothing, all that would open up. Now, of course, there were also restrictions imposed to those who are not vaccinated. For example, dine in. You cannot dine in if you do not have 2 doses and have completed 14 days. Otherwise, this was, of course, made to ensure minimal risk and to not increase the number of cases. Of course, only 80% of the workforce were allowed back into their workplace. So, to make sure that even sectors such as factories and all that were not having a huge number of COVID 19 cases. And of course, only certain sectors were allowed to operate during the COVID 19 pandemic. Of course, this is all dependent on the phases each state was in. Now, the effectiveness of these policies. So first of all, we're going to start with the results of the National Recovery Plan. So first of all would be that daily cases are now reaching less than 6,000 compared to a daily 10,000. This means that more people can go back to their daily lives, and this also means that more businesses and more sectors will be allowed to open up, which thus results in more economic activity, which would help the GDP. And of course, more economic sectors will open up for operation as different states were moved into different phases, meaning more business sectors were opened up, meaning more economic activity, which of course generates more money. Interstate travel was also not allowed, which allows for easier transportation from one state to another, meaning that workers can easily go back to their place of to their workplace. Overseas travel is also not allowed for international business, but of course these are subject to some restraints. And of course, 90% of the adult population have been vaccinated, which ensures minimal risk of cases happening. And this ensures that the Malaysian government and this ensures that the cases of COVID-19 wouldn't increase, which means we don't need to go back to phase one and close down the economy all over again. Now, of course, these results in general have allowed Malaysia's GDP to not plummet as much as it would have if these plans were not introduced. Of course, because of COVID 19, the economy will still plummet, GDP will still decrease. However, it wouldn't be as bad as initially thought due to these recovery plans and due to these policies. Thank you. That's all I have for today. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Next, we'll be looking at the comparison of GDP with other nations. There are generally two ways to calculate the GDP, which is the expenditure approach and the income approach. Each of these approaches looks to best approximate the monetary value of all final goods and services produced in an economy over a set period, which is normally 1 year. So the first one we'll be looking at is the product approach. Based on the table, there are three countries that we've taken as an example to calculate the GDP, which is Malaysia, Egypt, and Pakistan. As you can see, each country's GDP is divided based on their contribution to each sector, which is the agricultural sector, manufacturing sector, services sector, and other sectors. The value of GDP is shown in both US dollars and their local currencies. Based on this table, Egypt has the highest GDP among the countries, followed by Malaysia, then Pakistan. Although Egypt's GDP is the highest, but in terms of economic growth, Pakistan's agricultural sector contributes the highest percentage, which is 23.8% compared to Egypt, which is only 11.8%. Agriculture is one of the key sectors of Pakistan's economy. It compromises crops, livestock, forestry, and fishing, with crops being the major component. 48% of labor force is engaged directly with agriculture. So it is the main source of living and income of the major part of the economy population in Pakistan. Although Pakistan's agricultural sector is higher than Malaysia, but Malaysia's manufacturing sector has a higher percentage, which is 20.1%, than Pakistan, which is only 12.0%. This is because Pakistan's manufacturing sector is dominated by textiles, food, beverages, and tobacco, coke and petroleum, and pharmaceuticals. The manufacturing sector is made up of three parts, which is the large scale manufacturing, small scale manufacturing, and slaughtering. Whereas Malaysia, on the other hand, is one of the world's largest exporters of semiconductor devices, electrical devices, and IT and communication products. The industrial sector mostly contributes to electronic industry, automotive industry, and construction industry. The electrical and electronics industry (E&E) is the leading sector in Malaysia's manufacturing sector, contributing significantly to the country's export 32.8% and employment of 27.2% in 2013. Malaysia benefits from the global demand in the usage of mobile devices such as smartphones and tablets, storage device, optoelectronics such as LEDs, and embedded technology. Lastly, for the services sector, the services sector contributes the highest percentage to most countries' GDP. In comparison, Malaysia's service sector has the highest percentage, which is 55.7% among the three countries. followed by Egypt, which is 54.5%, and Pakistan, 52.4%. For the second one, we'll be looking at the comparison of GDP based on the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach to calculating GDP includes all consumer spending, government spending, business investment spending, and net exports. Egypt's household final consumption expenditure contributes the highest to its GDP as much as 82.8% compared to Malaysia and Pakistan. Household final consumption expenditure is typically the largest component of final use of GDP, representing in general around 60% of GDP. This component covers all purchases made by resident household to meet their everyday needs such as food, clothing, rents, energy, transport, goods, notably cars. Malaysia's export contributes the highest percentage, which is 67.2% to its GDP. Malaysia's main exports are electrical and electronic products, chemicals, petroleum products, liquefied natural gas, and palm oil. Egypt's percentage of export is 10.4%, whereas Pakistan is the lowest with 8.7%. Pakistan's import, on the other hand, is the lowest at 15.8% of their GDP, whereas Malaysia's import of goods and services contributes the highest percentage at 60.8%. Example of Pakistan's imported goods are iron, steel, animal and vegetable fats, plastics, plastic articles, organic chemicals, vehicles, cotton, and oil seeds. Whereas Malaysia's main imports are electrical and electronic products as well, chemicals, petroleum products and machinery, appliances and parts. Their main import partners are China, Singapore, European Union, the United States, Japan and Thailand. Note that the purchase of domestic goods and services increases GDP because it increases domestic production, but the purchase of imported goods and services has no direct impact on GDP. Therefore, although Malaysia's import is the highest, but it does not affect the country's GDP. Thank you.